Moving into Willowbrook Estates felt like stepping into a postcard-perfect suburban dream. Manicured lawns stretched like green carpets, white picket fences gleamed in the morning sun, and every house looked like it had been plucked from a home and garden magazine. I had just retired early from my career in corporate law and was looking forward to a peaceful life of gardening and quiet mornings with my coffee. What I didn't anticipate was meeting Karen Pembleton, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood perfection and president of our homeowners association for the past 8 years running. Karen was the type of person who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and kept a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws in her purse at all times. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind, wore pressed khakis even to check her mailbox, and drove a white SUV with a bumper sticker that read, "Following rules makes good neighbors." From my first week in the neighborhood, I could see her making her daily rounds, clipboard in hand, documenting every minor infraction with the dedication of a forensic investigator. But before we dive deeper into this tale of suburban warfare, I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you are, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to Karen Eat World for more unbelievable stories about the most entitled people you'll ever encounter. Trust me, this one is just getting started, and you won't want to miss how this plays out. My introduction to Karen's particular brand of leadership came on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was in my backyard, carefully tending to the vegetable garden I had spent weeks planning and planting. Years of high-stress corporate life had left me craving something peaceful and productive, and growing my own vegetables seemed like the perfect hobby. I had researched the best varieties for our climate zone, invested in quality soil amendments, and even installed a sophisticated drip irrigation system. My pride and joy were 6 beautiful eggplant seedlings that I had started from heirloom seeds, varieties you simply couldn't find in any grocery store. The morning sun was warming the soil when I heard the distinctive click-click-click of high heels on concrete. Karen appeared at my back gate, which I had left open while I worked, looking like she was conducting a military inspection. She wore a crisp white polo shirt with HOA President embroidered in navy blue script, and carried her ever-present clipboard. "Good morning," she called out in a voice that sounded friendly but had an edge that made you immediately suspicious. "I'm Karen Pembleton, your HOA president. I thought I'd stop by to welcome you to the neighborhood and make sure you're familiar with our community standards." I straightened up from where I had been weeding around my tomato plants and walked over to greet her properly. "Good morning, Karen. I'm definitely familiar with the HOA rules. I read through all the documentation before I purchased the house." This was true. My years as a corporate attorney had taught me to always read the fine print, and I had spent an entire weekend reviewing every single page of the HOA covenant. Karen's smile became a little more genuine when she heard this. She clearly approved of residents who took the rules seriously. Wonderful. So many new residents don't bother to educate themselves. Now, I couldn't help but notice your garden. It's quite impressive for someone who just moved in. I felt a small surge of pride. The garden really was coming along nicely, with neat rows of vegetables and herbs laid out in an efficient but attractive pattern. Thank you. I've always wanted space for a proper vegetable garden. In my old place, I only had a small patio. Karen nodded approvingly as she surveyed my work. Vegetable gardens can be wonderful additions to a neighborhood, as long as they're maintained properly. I trust you'll keep everything looking neat and tidy? The way she said it made it clear this wasn't really a question. Of course, I replied. I plan to keep everything well weeded and properly staked. I've even installed an irrigation system to make sure everything stays healthy. Excellent, Karen said, making a note on her clipboard. And these eggplants look like they're going to be particularly productive. What variety are you growing? I was surprised she knew enough about gardening to identify the eggplants, which were still quite small. They're a mix of heirloom varieties. Black Beauty, Rosa Bianca, and Japanese Long. I started them from seed back in February. Karen's eyes lit up with what seemed like genuine interest. How fascinating. I've always wanted to try growing heirloom eggplants, but I never seem to have the time. You'll have to let me know how they turn out. At the time, I thought this was just neighborly curiosity. I had no idea that Karen was already making mental notes about my garden's most valuable crops. We chatted for a few more minutes about gardening and neighborhood activities before she continued on her rounds. I went back to my weeding, feeling cautiously optimistic about my new community. The next few weeks passed peacefully. My garden flourished in the late spring weather, and my eggplants in particular seemed to love their sunny spot near the back fence. They grew from small seedlings into robust plants with deep purple flowers that would soon become the fruits I was so eagerly anticipating. I had researched dozens of recipes I wanted to try once harvest time arrived. Karen continued her daily neighborhood patrols, occasionally stopping to chat about how well my garden was progressing. She always seemed particularly interested in the eggplants, asking about their growth rate and when I expected them to be ready for harvest. I was pleased to have found a fellow gardening enthusiast and happily answered all her questions. Then came the morning that changed everything. I had developed a routine of checking my garden first thing every morning with my coffee, enjoying the peaceful quiet before the neighborhood came fully awake. It was early June, and my eggplants had finally started producing. 3 perfect specimens had ripened to a beautiful deep purple, hanging heavy and glossy from their stems. I had been planning to harvest them that very morning to make my grandmother's famous eggplant parmesan recipe. But when I walked out to my garden, coffee mug in hand, I stopped dead in my tracks. The 3 ripe eggplants were gone. Not fallen to the ground, not damaged by animals, but clearly cut from their stems with a clean blade. The cuts were so neat and precise that they looked almost surgical. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that perhaps a neighbor had some kind of emergency and needed vegetables, though I couldn't imagine any scenario where someone would take eggplants specifically. My second thought was that maybe I was mistaken about where the ripe ones had been growing, but I had been checking them daily and knew exactly which plants they had been on. As I stood there puzzling over the missing vegetables, I heard that familiar click-click-click of heels on concrete. Karen appeared at my gate right on schedule for her morning rounds, looking as perfectly put together as always. "Good morning," she called cheerfully. "How's the garden looking today?" "Well," I said, still staring at the spots where my eggplants had been, "it's interesting you ask. I seem to be missing some vegetables that were ready for harvest." Karen walked over to where I was standing and looked at the eggplant plants with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Oh no. What kind of vegetables? Maybe we have deer in the neighborhood. Or rabbits." 3 ripe eggplants," I said. "But the cuts look too clean to be from animals. Someone used a knife or garden shears." Karen frowned and examined the cut stems more closely. "That is odd. The cuts do look very neat. Maybe we have a vegetable thief in the neighborhood. I should send out an email to all the residents to keep an eye out for suspicious activity." She seemed so genuinely concerned and helpful that I began to doubt my growing suspicion. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe there really was someone sneaking around the neighborhood stealing vegetables, as bizarre as that sounded. "I appreciate that," I said. "I'll keep a closer eye on things. Maybe install a security camera if it happens again." Karen nodded enthusiastically. "That's a great idea. We can never be too careful about protecting our property. I hope you don't lose any more of your beautiful vegetables." She made a few notes on her clipboard about the incident and continued on her rounds. I went back inside, still puzzled but willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, why would the HOA president steal eggplants from a neighbor's garden? 3 days later, I had my answer. I had started getting up 15 minutes earlier each morning to check my garden more carefully, and I had noticed 2 more eggplants that would be ready to harvest within a day or 2. This time, I made a mental note of exactly which plants they were on and even took a photo with my phone so there would be no confusion. The next morning, they were gone. Same clean cuts, same surgical precision. This time, I was angry. Someone was definitely stealing my vegetables, and it wasn't deer or rabbits. I spent the morning researching security cameras online and had just placed an order for a wireless system when I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. As I strolled down Maple Street, 2 blocks from my house, I passed Karen's immaculate colonial-style home. Her yard was a masterpiece of suburban perfection, with a manicured lawn that looked like it was trimmed with scissors and flower beds that appeared to be arranged by a professional designer. But what caught my eye was something sitting on her front porch. A wicker basket, filled with fresh vegetables, sat next to her front door like a farmer's market display. And there, nestled among tomatoes and zucchini and bell peppers, were two dark purple eggplants that looked remarkably familiar. I felt my blood pressure spike as I stared at what were almost certainly my missing vegetables. The size, the color, even a small blemish I remembered on one of them, these were definitely from my garden. But I forced myself to stay calm and think like the lawyer I used to be. I needed evidence, not just suspicion. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the basket from the sidewalk, making sure to capture the eggplants clearly. Then I walked home and compared them to the photos I had taken the day before. The match was unmistakable. Karen Pembleton, pillar of the community and HOA president, was stealing vegetables from my garden. The question was what to do about it. My first instinct was to march over there and confront her directly, but something held me back. Maybe it was my legal training, or maybe it was curiosity about how far she would take this bizarre behavior. Instead, I decided to set a trap. That afternoon, I installed the security camera I had ordered, positioning it carefully to capture a clear view of my eggplant plants. I also made a point of mentioning to Karen the next time I saw her that I had several more eggplants that would be ready for harvest in the next few days, and how excited I was to finally make that eggplant parmesan I had been planning. Karen listened with apparent interest and sympathy. "I do hope you don't lose any more vegetables to our mystery thief," she said. "Have you considered that it might be teenagers? Sometimes they do these things as pranks." "Maybe," I replied. "But I've installed a security camera now, so if anyone comes into my garden, I'll have them on video." For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Karen's face. It might have been concern, or maybe just annoyance. But she recovered quickly and smiled brightly. "That's very smart of you. I'm sure that will solve the problem." 2 mornings later, I woke up to find 3 more eggplants missing from my garden. But this time, I had something I didn't have before: high-definition video footage of Karen Pembleton entering my backyard at 5:30 in the morning, cutting my eggplants from their stems with a pair of garden shears, and walking away with them in a canvas tote bag. I sat in my kitchen, watching the footage on my laptop screen, and felt a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't just theft, it was a violation of trust, an abuse of her position in the community, and frankly, just bizarre behavior from someone who was supposed to be a leader. But as I watched Karen's stealthy morning harvest, I realized something that made me even angrier. She wasn't just stealing my vegetables randomly. She was specifically targeting the eggplants, and only the ones that were perfectly ripe. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was planned, methodical, and showed that she had been studying my garden carefully to time her raids for maximum impact. The woman who lectured the neighborhood about following rules and respecting property was a calculating vegetable thief. I made copies of the video footage and saved them to multiple devices. Then I got dressed and walked over to Karen's house, where I could see the evidence of her crime still sitting in that wicker basket on her front porch. The eggplants from my garden were prominently displayed alongside what I now realized were probably vegetables stolen from other neighbors' gardens as well. Karen answered her door wearing a pink bathrobe and slippers, looking surprised to see me so early in the morning. "Good morning," I said calmly. "I wanted to let you know that I caught our vegetable thief on camera last night." Karen's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: surprise, concern, curiosity, and then what might have been fear, all in the space of about 3 seconds. "Really?" she said. "That's wonderful. Did you see who it was?" "I did," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. "It was you, Karen." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear birds chirping in the distance. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Finally, she seemed to find her voice. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's also a very serious crime," I replied. "I have you on high-definition video, entering my property at 5:30 this morning, cutting eggplants from my plants, and leaving with them. And unless I'm mistaken, those are my eggplants in your basket right there." Karen's eyes darted to the basket on her porch, and I saw her realize that she had been caught red-handed. But instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, she did something that surprised me. She straightened her shoulders and looked me directly in the eye with an expression of righteous indignation. "Those eggplants were growing over the property line," she said. "According to HOA regulations, any vegetation that extends beyond a resident's property boundaries becomes community property." I was simply following the rules. I stared at her, amazed by the audacity of her lie. My eggplants were growing at least 3 feet from the property line, in raised beds that were clearly within my yard boundaries. "Karen," I said slowly, "my eggplants are nowhere near the property line. You can see in the video exactly where you cut them from. And even if they were over the line, which they're not, that wouldn't give you the right to trespass on my property to steal them." But Karen had apparently decided that her best defense was a good offense. She crossed her arms and assumed the imperious tone I was beginning to recognize as her default setting when challenged. "I don't appreciate your accusations," she said. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to enforce all community regulations, including those regarding property boundaries and landscaping standards. If you have a problem with my actions, you're welcome to file a formal complaint." I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat at the sheer absurdity of her response. She was suggesting that I file a complaint with the HOA about the HOA president stealing my vegetables, apparently expecting me to complain to her about her own criminal behavior. "I think I'll take a different approach," I said. "I'll be filing a police report for theft and trespassing." For the first time since I had confronted her, Karen looked genuinely alarmed. "Now wait just a minute," she said quickly. "There's no need to involve law enforcement. I'm sure we can work this out like civilized neighbors. I gave you the chance to handle this like a civilized neighbor when I first suspected what was happening," I replied. "You chose to lie to my face and continue stealing from my garden. Actions have consequences, Karen." I turned to walk away, but Karen called after me. "You know, I've been meaning to discuss some concerns about your garden with you anyway. There have been complaints from other residents about the appearance and maintenance." I stopped and turned back to face her. "What kind of complaints?" Karen seemed to sense that she had found some leverage and her confidence returned. "Well, some neighbors feel that vegetable gardens are inconsistent with our community's aesthetic standards. And there are questions about whether your irrigation system complies with water usage restrictions." I could see what she was doing. Having been caught stealing, she was now trying to create HOA violations that she could use to force me to remove my garden entirely. It was a petty, vindictive response that showed exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. "Show me the specific HOA regulations that my garden violates," I said. "Chapter and verse." Karen's confident expression faltered slightly. "I'll have to research the specific language, but I'm sure we can find applicable sections." "I'm sure you'll try," I replied. "But you might want to remember that I was a corporate attorney for 25 years before I retired. I know exactly what our HOA covenant says, and I know exactly what constitutes a legitimate violation versus harassment." With that, I walked away, leaving Karen standing in her doorway looking like she was trying to solve a complex math problem in her head. Over the next week, Karen launched what I can only describe as a campaign of petty harassment designed to force me to move out of the neighborhood. It started with a formal written notice claiming that my garden violated the HOA's landscaping standards because vegetables were not specifically mentioned in the approved plant list. When I responded with copies of the relevant sections that explicitly allowed food gardens as long as they were properly maintained, she sent another notice claiming that my tomato stakes were too tall and created a visual obstruction. When I pointed out that the covenant specified height limits for fences and structures, not individual plants or their support systems, she pivoted to complaining about my irrigation system. According to her latest interpretation of the rules, any automated watering system required prior HOA approval, which I had not obtained. I responded to each frivolous complaint with detailed legal citations and documentation, but Karen seemed determined to bury me in paperwork and manufactured violations. She was clearly hoping that I would get frustrated and either remove my garden or move out of the neighborhood entirely. What she didn't realize was that her harassment campaign was actually helping me build a case against her. Every bogus complaint, every twisted interpretation of the rules, every attempt to selectively enforce regulations that didn't actually exist, all of it was documented evidence of her abuse of power as HOA president. But the final straw came when I discovered that Karen wasn't satisfied with just stealing my eggplants. She had apparently decided that if she couldn't force me to remove my garden through fake HOA violations, she would sabotage it directly. I woke up one morning to find that someone had carefully sabotaged my irrigation system during the night. Not destroyed it completely, which would have been obvious vandalism, but subtly damaged several emitters so that water would spray onto my neighbor's fence instead of onto my plants. It was the kind of calculated mischief that was designed to kill my vegetables slowly while making it look like equipment failure. But Karen had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to sabotage my garden, she had left footprints in the soft soil around my raised beds. Small footprints, made by someone wearing narrow athletic shoes with a distinctive tread pattern. The same tread pattern I had noticed on the shoes Karen wore for her daily neighborhood patrols. That afternoon, I did something that Karen probably wasn't expecting. I made a phone call to my former law firm senior partner, who also happened to be one of my oldest friends. David Chen and I had worked together for over 2 decades, and he owed me more favors than either of us could count. More importantly, David had connections throughout the legal and business communities that would prove very useful for what I had in mind. "I need some information," I told David after we had caught up on personal news. "I'm having a problem with my HOA president, and I want to know everything there is to know about her financial situation, her employment history, and any legal troubles she might have had." David chuckled. "HOA drama? I thought you retired to get away from conflict." "So did I replied. "But apparently conflict found me anyway. This woman has been stealing from my garden, harassing me with fake violations, and now she's sabotaging my property. I want to know what I'm dealing with." "Send me her full name and address," David said. "Give me 48 hours. What David found was even more interesting than I had hoped. Karen Pembleton, it turned out, had quite a colorful history that she had managed to keep hidden from her neighbors. Before moving to our pristine suburban community, she had been forced to resign from her job as an office manager at a small accounting firm following allegations of embezzling petty cash. The charges had been dropped when she agreed to pay restitution, but the incident had effectively ended her career in financial management. More importantly, David's research revealed that Karen was in serious financial trouble. She had been making only minimum payments on multiple credit cards for over a year, had missed several mortgage payments, and was facing foreclosure proceedings that had been temporarily delayed by a loan modification agreement. The immaculate house and perfect lifestyle were apparently being maintained through debt and financial desperation. But the most useful piece of information David uncovered was about Karen's employment situation. For the past 3 years, she had been working part-time as a customer service representative for a large insurance company that had very strict policies about employee conduct. Any criminal charges, even minor ones, would result in immediate termination. And without that income, modest as it was, Karen would almost certainly lose her house. Armed with this information, I began to formulate a plan that would be far more devastating than anything Karen could have imagined when she decided to steal my eggplants. The beauty of Karen's situation was that her entire campaign against me was based on her position as HOA president and her supposed authority to interpret and enforce community rules. She had made herself vulnerable by abusing that position so blatantly and creating such extensive documentation of her misconduct. My plan would use her own tactics against her, but with the precision and thoroughness that only someone with my legal background could execute. Phase 1 began with a comprehensive audit of Karen's performance as HOA president. I spent 2 weeks reviewing every email she had sent to residents, every violation notice she had issued, every decision she had made over the past 2 years. What I found was a pattern of selective enforcement, personal vendetta, and financial irregularities that would make any competent lawyer salivate. Karen had been using her position to settle personal scores and to benefit her own property at the expense of her neighbors. She had ignored violations by residents she liked while pursuing bogus complaints against those she didn't. She had approved landscaping changes for her friends that she had denied for others using identical proposals. Most damaging of all, she had been using HOA funds to pay for improvements to common areas that primarily benefited her own property, including a new sidewalk that gave her easier access to the community mailboxes and landscaping for a common area that was visible primarily from her front windows. But the smoking gun was what I found when I cross-referenced her violation notices with property records. Karen had been systematically targeting residents who were behind on their HOA dues with frivolous complaints, apparently trying to force them to sell their homes so that the HOA could recover the money through new buyers. It was a calculated abuse of power that bordered on extortion. Phase 2 involved documenting every instance of theft, trespassing, and property damage that Karen had committed against me personally. I had the video footage of her stealing my eggplants, photographs of the evidence on her front porch, and documentation of the irrigation system's sabotage, including those telltale footprint impressions. I also had records of every false complaint she had filed and every bogus violation notice she had sent. But Phase 3 was where things got interesting. You see, what Karen didn't know about me was that my legal career hadn't just been about corporate law. I had spent the last 5 years before retirement specializing in HOA governance and community association law, helping developers and management companies navigate the complex regulations that govern these organizations. I knew every rule, every loophole, and every vulnerability in the system that Karen thought she controlled. And I had learned something very interesting about our particular HOA during my research. The community had been incorporated under a specific set of state regulations that included provisions for emergency removal of board members who had committed fraud or engaged in criminal conduct. More importantly, these provisions allowed any member in good standing to initiate removal proceedings by presenting evidence to the state regulatory agency that oversees community associations. But here's where it got really devastating for Karen. Under our state's HOA regulations, any board member who was removed for cause would be personally liable for any financial damages they had caused to the association or its members. And given Karen's creative use of HOA funds and her systematic harassment campaign, those damages could be substantial. Phase 4 was where I used the connections and resources that my legal career had provided. Remember, I hadn't just been any corporate lawyer, I had been a senior partner at one of the state's most prestigious firms, with clients that included major real estate developers, financial institutions, and government agencies. I had relationships with people who could make Karen's life very complicated very quickly. My first call was to the state regulatory agency that oversees HOA operations. I had worked with their enforcement division on several cases over the years, and I knew exactly how to present a complaint that would get their immediate attention. I provided them with a comprehensive dossier documenting Karen's misconduct, including the video evidence of theft, financial records showing misuse of HOA funds, and a detailed timeline of her abuse of power. My second call was to the district attorney's office, where I had contacts in their white-collar crime division. Theft, trespassing, and destruction of property might seem like minor offenses, but when they're committed by someone in a position of public trust, prosecutors tend to take them more seriously. Especially when the perpetrator has a history of financial misconduct and is facing foreclosure. My third call was to Karen's employer. I didn't make any accusations or demands, I simply provided them with copies of the police report I had filed and the video evidence of their employee committing crimes against her neighbors. Their employee conduct policy would take care of the rest. But the masterstroke, the piece of revenge that was perfectly tailored to Karen's specific obsession with rules and property values, came when I made my final phone call. You see, during my research into the neighborhood's history, I had discovered something fascinating about the property development that had created our community. The original developer had retained ownership of several small parcels of land throughout the neighborhood, apparently intending to use them for additional amenities that were never built. These parcels had been sitting unused for over a decade, generating minimal tax revenue but still legally owned by the development company. The development company had been one of my clients during my legal career. One phone call to my former client, one very reasonable offer to purchase their unused land parcels, and suddenly I own 3 strategically located pieces of property throughout Willowbrook Estates, including a narrow strip of land that ran directly behind Karen's backyard. But I wasn't planning to build anything on that land. Instead, I was going to do something that would be perfectly legal, completely within all applicable regulations, and absolutely devastating to Karen's property values and quality of life. I was going to turn it into a certified organic composting facility. Under state environmental regulations, small-scale composting operations are considered beneficial land use that can't be prohibited by local zoning or HOA rules. As long as the facility meets certain technical specifications and maintains proper setbacks from neighboring structures, it's legally protected as an agricultural activity. And the beautiful irony was that the composting facility would be supplied primarily by food waste from local restaurants and grocery stores, including tons of rejected produce that would create exactly the kind of aromatic, fly-attracting environment that would make Karen's perfect backyard absolutely unbearable. The morning I filed all the necessary permits and notifications, I also sent Karen a certified letter informing her that I was aware of her theft, trespassing, and property damage, and that I had provided evidence of these crimes to the appropriate authorities. I explained that while I couldn't control what actions the police, the district attorney, the state regulatory agency, or her employer might take, I wanted her to know that her campaign of harassment had consequences. But I saved the best news for last. I informed her that as the new owner of the land parcel behind her house, I would be developing it into a state-certified organic composting facility that would be operational within 30 days. I included copies of all the relevant permits and regulations that made this development legally bulletproof, along with a detailed explanation of how the facility would operate. 3 days later, I was in my garden harvesting tomatoes when I heard a sound I had never heard before in our quiet neighborhood. It was the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs in what could only be described as pure, unadulterated rage. I looked up to see Karen standing in her backyard, holding my certified letter in one shaking hand, staring at the surveyor stakes that marked the boundaries of my new composting facility. Her face was bright red, her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and she was making noises that sounded more animal than human. As I watched, Karen seemed to realize that someone might be observing her meltdown. She looked around frantically until her eyes met mine across the fence line. For a moment, we stared at each other in complete silence. Then Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water, as the full scope of what I had done finally sank in. She understood that her theft of my eggplants had triggered a legal and financial avalanche that would destroy everything she had worked to build in this neighborhood. Her house would become unsellable due to its proximity to the composting facility. Her position as HOA president was about to end in disgrace and potential criminal charges. Her employment was almost certainly terminated. And her already precarious financial situation was about to become completely untenable. Karen Pembleton, the woman who had stolen my eggplants because she thought she could get away with it, had just realized that she had picked a fight with the wrong neighbor. The expression on her face at that moment, the dawning comprehension that her own petty theft had led to her complete and total downfall, was worth every eggplant she had ever stolen. And there you have it, folks, the incredible true story of how stealing a few eggplants led to the most epic HOA downfall you'll ever hear. If you enjoyed this wild ride of suburban justice, please smash that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more unbelievable stories about entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Trust me, we've got plenty more where that came from, and you won't want to miss a single tale of karmic revenge.